All right. Hey, everybody. So I'm doing a test to prepare to live stream my 2023 year ahead horoscopes for all 12 of the rising signs for the entire next 12 months. So I decided to try to do an experiment to do these as a live stream. So I'm testing that out with this first video and still getting the hang of it, but I think this might actually work. So I wanted to start just by giving an overview of some of the dates that I'm going to be talking about for the major highlights over the course of the next year. All right, so here are the astrological alignments in 2023, the major ones that I want to focus in on as I go through my horoscopes. So the first one is we've got the Mars retrograde in Gemini, which is still finishing up once we move into the beginning of 2023. So we know the Mars retrograde kind of dominated the second half of this year after Mars went into Gemini in August of 2022. And then the pre-retrograde shadow began in early September, and Mars finally stationed retrograde on October 30th. So at the very beginning of 2023, Mars will actually station direct on January 12th in Gemini, and then it'll begin the long process of coming out of the post-retrograde shadow and finishing up the entire shadow period by the time that Mars leaves Gemini on March 25th. So that's one of the major highlights of the early part of the year, is just the cleanup stage of that Mars retrograde. But because there will be a direct station, there may still be some major turning points and events in people's lives, so that we're not quite out of it at this point. All right, so that's one of the first things that happens at the beginning of the year. The other major shift that happens this year is Saturn is completing its 3-year transit through the sign of Aquarius, and it's actually going to be moving into Pisces starting on March 7th. So this is going to be the final period that it departs from Aquarius and the final time that Saturn moves into Pisces, and it's actually going to stay there for the next 3 years until early 2026. So this is a pretty significant, pretty major shift. In the horoscopes, I'm going to talk a lot about what house Saturn is departing from and what house it's going to ingress into, because that's going to begin a period of consolidation over the course of the next 3 years. All right, so Saturn into Pisces is a major move. Interestingly, although, on the one hand, you would think that Saturn departing from Aquarius is going to lighten up the mood in the Saturn or the Aquarius sector of our chart over the course of the next 3 years. Unfortunately, or depending on how you want to put it, we've got another transit that's coming in pretty hot right after that, which is Pluto moving into Aquarius, or just dipping into Aquarius already right away in March, starting on March 23rd. And it doesn't stay there the entire year. This is just an initial preview of that transit, but we do get a few months from March 23rd until June 11th, where Pluto dips into Aquarius, and we will see the intensification in mundane astrology of a lot of topics associated with Aquarius, which have to do with things like technology, communications, and other things like that, where we're going to see some of the technological things that have been developing over the course of the past 30 years, ever since, for example, the World Wide Web started with Saturn and Aquarius 30 years ago. And we're going to see some of that stuff just taken to the extreme, because Pluto tends to take little things and blow them up into big things, and that's one of its key things. So that's going to happen to some extent in whatever the Aquarius house is in our chart, and we're just going to get a little preview of what that's going to be like over the course of that 3-month period between March and June, before we settle in over the course of the next few years for a much longer term transit of Pluto and Aquarius, because Pluto is actually going to be going through Aquarius for the next 20 years. So that's a really long-term transit that we're just getting a little bit of a preview of this year. All right, let me check, see how the stream is doing. I see there's people in the live chat. I can't follow the chat as much as I like, but I'll check it out later. Thanks everyone for joining me live today. All right, so moving on to the other part of this. I've talked about some of the heavier transits with Saturn and Pluto. One of the more positive transits that's happening this year is that Jupiter is going to zoom through Aries for the first 5 months of the year, because it will have just ingressed back into Aries in late December of 2022. And then Jupiter's just going to zoom through Aries over the course of the first 5 months of the year. And it's going to be complemented by we're starting to see a shift of some eclipses will start happening in the Aries and Libra axis this year. So eclipses represent major beginnings and major endings, whereas Jupiter represents a period of growth and expansion. So I think for some people, depending on where the Aries house is in your chart, essentially, that you're going to see some major beginnings and a major period of growth and expansion in that sector of your life, which will be pretty good depending on what house that falls in your chart. So Jupiter's going to move through there pretty quickly, though, the first 5 months of the year. And by mid-May, Jupiter moves into Taurus, and then it spends pretty much the entire second half of 2023 with Jupiter moving through the sign of Taurus. And that's also one of the signs that we're going to be seeing eclipses taking place this year. Especially in October, we're going to see a lunar eclipse in the sign of Taurus on October 28th. So major beginnings, major endings, culminations, but also growth and expansion. So for some people, eclipses can be a time of endings where one chapter of their life ends and another begins. But hopefully with that Jupiter boost this year, it will be experienced, even if you have some setbacks or some endings, as a period where you're growing and you're moving forward ultimately. And since Jupiter's also going to get kind of close to Uranus, some of this can be kind of innovative and kind of exciting at the same time in terms of having a feeling of being liberated and moving in a direction that you haven't headed before, potentially somewhat rapidly, because Jupiter likes to do things pretty quick when it expands. All right, so the Jupiter transits are pretty awesome. We also have a Venus retrograde transit in the sign of Leo that's taking place this year. The ingress at first moves into Leo on June 5th, then it's going to station retrograde on July 22nd, and that's when we enter the most intense phase of the transit between July 22nd until eventually September 3rd, when Venus finally stations direct and begins moving forward again. Those are the two most important key dates, July 22nd and September 3rd, and pretty much the entire time in between when Venus is moving backwards in the order of the signs of the zodiac while staying in Leo. But really the entire transit isn't finished until Venus departs from Leo finally on October 8th. So what this ends up meaning is everybody's going to get an extended multiple month long Venus transit in the Leo sector of your chart. So for some people, this is going to involve going back and looking back into the past in the Leo sector of your chart, sometimes revisiting old relationships or old decisions from the past, and seeing if you made the right choice, or in some instances, going back and rethinking things and deciding that you'd like to do things differently the second time around compared to what you did previously or what you did earlier. So Venus retrogrades sometimes bring up events in 8-year increments, because the last time we had a Venus retrograde in the same spot in the zodiac was exactly 8 years ago. So that would be back in like the summer of 2015. And sometimes there can be a connection between that period and this one, just because Venus is retracing her steps pretty closely compared to that time. All right, so that's the Venus retrograde. And then finally, I've already mentioned this briefly, which is the eclipses in the sign of Aries and Scorpio, which happens in April and May. And then the other set of eclipses, which takes place in the Libra and Taurus signs later in the year in October, and yeah, pretty much just in October. So my keywords, as I've always said, for eclipses is major beginnings and major endings. So sometimes eclipses can be kind of tumultuous, and it can feel like things are kind of thrown up in the air and everything becomes chaotic for a period of time. And I know that was definitely an experience of a lot of the people with fixed signs rising recently this year in 2022, when most of the eclipses were just taking place in the Taurus and Scorpio axis. So we're going to see a continuation of some of those themes of those eclipses and the two houses that they've been activating in your chart that align with Taurus and Scorpio, but it's going to bring to conclusion whatever that storyline has been over the course of the past year or year and a half, by the time we get the final eclipse in that axis in October, which is the Taurus one. So it's going to be wrapping that up. So most of the periods of major beginnings and major endings should come to a completion. And then after that point, the Taurus and Scorpio axis of your chart will start to settle down a little bit. And instead, we'll start to see a shift towards this new period of major beginnings and endings taking place instead in the Aries and Libra axis of your chart. So I'd recommend paying attention to whatever houses align with those signs in your chart, using the doctrine of the 12 houses or a diagram like this one that I have up on the screen right now that just shows what part of your life those houses relate to, and then just understand that the significations of those houses, those two opposing houses, are going to become much more active and much more of the focus for you as the eclipses in Aries and Libra start to move into that sector of your chart over the course of the next year or two. So major beginnings and major endings. All right, so those are pretty much the major transits. There's other things, there's like Mercury retrogrades and other alignments that we're going to talk about a little bit in the year ahead forecast that we're recording next week, which we're going to record on December 16th with a live audience of patrons through our page on patreon.com. So if you'd like to join us for the live recording of that through Zoom, which is like a live webinar with a live chat, then you can go ahead and sign up through our page on Patreon. But otherwise, this was just a little test to get warmed up for doing the year ahead horoscopes. And I'm next going to move into doing a live stream after this one, once I get the hang of it, of doing the horoscope forecast for the sign of Aries and Aries rising for 2023. Here's a quick little preview of that where I'm just going to try to personalize a little bit more by contextualizing each of these transits within the context of the 12 houses to talk about what area of life and what significations you should see specifically come up for you more personally in your life and in your birth chart over the course of the next year. All right, so I think that's it for this little horoscope forecast, or this little warm-up. So wish me luck, because it's going to take a few days to live stream all of these, but we'll see how it goes. And with any luck, I should have all the horoscopes finished by next week when we record the year ahead forecast. So thanks a lot for watching or joining me in the live stream. And let me see if I can check out the chat really quickly. There we go. Cool. All right. Thanks everyone for joining me. I'm having some issues with the live chat, but I'll get that worked out while I'm going through these horoscopes. So thanks everyone for watching or listening, and I'll see you again next time.